Okay, let's dive in. Just a reminder, you're working on A9 or D4. Other than that, hopefully everything's going smoothly with the assignments. Back to lecture material. We're tackling in these three lecture series the most difficult problem in robotics, which is the reality gap. We're going to talk about three different approaches. We talked about the Golem project last time. I mentioned just in passing last time in the early 90s when the field was just getting started, the first attempt to cross the reality gap was let's sprinkle some noise into the simulator so that the evolution cannot exploit inaccuracies in the simulator. In the Golem project, the intuition was let's just transfer from sim to real as many evolved robots as possible thanks to this new technology called 3D printers, and hope that some of them manage to cross the gap. And as we saw last time, some do. Today, we're going to talk about the Resilient Machines project that I spearheaded back in 2006. Golem project was 2000, Resilient Machines was 2006, where the intuition that I left you with last time is let's not just evolve robot controllers in a simulator. Let's evolve simulators to become more and more accurate, more and more closer to reality, basically try and evolve a closure to the gap. That's the intuition underneath the Resilient Machines project. And I started last time by sketching out the overall structure of this project. Inside this project, you're going to see that there are three evolutionary algorithms operating. One, which is going to be evolving simulators. A second evolutionary algorithm that's going to be evolving actions. And these actions are going to be evolved such that they give the physical robot more experiences, allow it to learn more about its reality. So we're going to evolve simulators. We're going to evolve actions in those simulators. We're going to send an informative action to the real robot. And then we're going to do real to sim. We're going to feed back the experiences from the real robot back to this evolutionary algorithm so that it can continue trying to improve simulators. That's the second evolutionary algorithm. You're going to see in a minute alternations around and around this cycle. And at the end of this cycle, when the simulators become accurate enough, we're going to take the most fit simulator and we're going to do what we've seen many times before in this class now, which is to evolve controllers in that evolved simulator. And to end the project, we're going to take the evolved controller that was evolved in an evolved simulator, send it to the real robot, cross our fingers and toes, and hope that we crossed the sim to real gap. Okay, that's the Resilient Machines project. Okay, off we go. We're going to start up here by evolving simulators. So unlike what you've been doing in the assignments where you build all the parts of the robot and connect them together, we're going to take, in this project, we're going to take a step back. And we're going to start with an empty simulator represented by the gray down here. And we're going to give a little bit of a hint. We're going to give some information. We're not starting from tabula rasa. We're not starting from a completely blank slate. We're going to tell this real robot that it's made up of these 9 parts. Unbeknownst to the robot, but maybe now beknownst to you, the robot is made up of one main part, the main body here. It's got 4 upper legs here and 4 lower legs down here. So what you're going to see when we start evolving simulators in a moment is the evolutionary algorithm trying to figure out how to put all these pieces together in a physics engine to approximate itself. So when I say that we're evolving simulators, what we're really doing is the real robot is evolving what became known as a self model, an understanding of itself. It's going to construct a simulation kind of inside that is its best attempt to approximate how it's put together and how it can interact with the environment. So I'm going to alternate back and forth this morning between talking about evolving simulators and evolving self-models. We'll see what these look like in a moment. Okay. we have the second evolutionary algorithm that's going to evolve actions. These actions are supposed to be designed that the real robot learns something about itself. At the moment, at this beginning of the experiment, the robot has not performed any actions yet. It knows nothing about itself. So what is the best action you can perform? The robot's about to push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. At this point in time where the robot doesn't know anything about itself, it knows a little bit about itself, it knows it's made up of these 9 parts. Are there better actions, worse actions, more informative actions, less informative actions?
It doesn't know anything about itself. It probably just send out random electric signals to its motors.
Absolutely. So at the beginning, when you know nothing about yourself, anything you do is going to give you new information. So at the beginning here, when we start, we're not going to evolve an action. The real robot's going to generate a random action. There it is. This particular body plan should look kind of familiar to you at this point. We've got 4 hip joints here and 4 knee joints. You'll notice that it's rotated upwards 6 of the motors and rotated down 2 of the motors. So I want you to put yourself in the robot's shoes for a moment. We've told the robot that it's made up of these 9 parts, but it doesn't know how these parts are put together. They could all be put together in a line. This robot could be a snake robot, it could be a biped, it could be a dog robot, it could be a starfish. It doesn't know. Imagine you're inside a dark room and in front of you are 8 levers, which are connected to the 8 motors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you can pull any of these 8 levers down or up. So we're going to restrict the actions to 2 to the 8. There are these 8 levers, and you can either pull them up or down. When we started this experiment back in 2006, the robot chose to rotate at random 6 of the motors upward and 2 of the motors downward. So we've got 8 motors. This robot has just 2 sensors on board. These are proprioceptive sensors. They give the robot a sense of, vestibular sensors. You have vestibular sensors. Where are they? In you. You're not really using them right now because you're sitting still and quiet. Your inner ear gives you information about how your head is oriented relative to gravity. So this robot, the real robot, has 2 vestibular sensors on board, and they're in the main body. And these 2 sensors report floating point values. They represent how much the robot is tilting left and right, sensor number 1, and how much the robot is tilting forward and back, sensor number 2. So going back to the dark room metaphor, you're in the dark room, you pull a couple of these levers, and you feel the room tilt a certain amount left and right and a certain amount forward and backwards. So we're restricting quite a bit what the robot can do and the kinds of sensory repercussions it can receive. It's pretty restricted just to keep things simple. As you're going to see, this experiment gets kind of complicated, so we try to keep things simple. Okay, it's a little difficult to see from this video. Let's see if I can get it to loop. Nope. Okay, I'll just play it a few times. If you look carefully, you'll notice towards the end of this video that the main body tilts away from the camera a little bit. So the robot's tilting about 10 degrees forward. Okay, so now the real robot comes to this second evolutionary algorithm, and when it arrives at this evolutionary algorithm, it has one data point. It says, I rotated the 8 motors like this, and I got this vestibular sensory repercussion. Okay. I'm going to show you now video. You're watching this second evolutionary algorithm running, and you can see the kinds of phenotypes, the kinds of things that each element in the population produces. You can see now why we often refer to these things that are evolving here as self-models. You're watching actually a longitudinal cut through this evolutionary algorithm. So you're looking at the most fit self-model in the population at any given point in this evolutionary period. What do you think the fitness of a self model is? I haven't told you anything about what the fitness function is here yet. There's a very strong hint in the video. You're watching the most fit self-model over evolutionary time, and although it might not look like it, these self-models are actually becoming more accurate. They're becoming more fit.
Is it just like to mimic where the center of the robot, like the angle, that 10-degree tilt, so it's trying to mimic that?
That's exactly it. So it, being the evolutionary algorithm, is trying to mimic or reproduce the vestibular information that came from the real robot. If you watch carefully, you'll notice that all these different self-models, the green block, which is the robot's main body, is tilting 10 degrees forward. So again, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the real robot at this point. At this point in time, the real robot says, well, I'm maybe built like this, I may be built like that, I may be built like that, I may be built like that. There are many self-models at this point that are getting very high fitness. There are many different descriptions of self that cause the robot to match the real sensor data. So if you're the real robot, what do you do at this point? If you're halfway intelligent, you know they can't all be right. I don't know what I'm actually like in reality, but I'm only one thing. I can't be all these different things. So I'm going to
Probably do another random action and then try to simulate it to get a more accurate self-model.
The real robot doesn't have enough information about itself. It's pushed against the world. It's pushed against the world once, and the world has pushed back once. It's not enough. So we're going to go around and around and around. You mentioned the robot could perform another random action. It could. Turns out there's a smarter thing that the robot can do. That's why we're going to start evolving actions here rather than just picking them at random. Actually, performing random actions isn't that bad. You often end up getting enough information, but there's something you can do that's smarter than random. You could do the opposite of what you just did, something that's very, very different from what you just did. We're on the right track. There's a twist on that that's even more intelligent. The more you think about it, it's actually not that trivial. And this connects to back to developmental psychology, which we've touched on a few times in this course already. The study of human development, how babies turn into functioning and thriving adults. If you've ever watched a little tiny baby or a very young toddler, they're never still. They're always moving, putting stuff in their mouths, tripping, falling, getting back up again. It's known in the field as motor babbling. Obviously, babies also verbally babble, but they motorically babble. They're always doing stuff. And for a long time, the idea was probably what the babies are doing is just a whole bunch of random actions to learn as much about their bodies as possible. We've talked in this course a couple times about self and non-self discrimination. Turns out there's something that babies might be doing that's smarter than random, and even a little bit smarter than just do the opposite of what I just did. It's a little tricky. Again, the way to think about this is to put yourself in the shoes of the robot. It has many self-models at this point that from its perspective so far are accurate. The real robot is now entering this part of its experimental phase. It's thinking about, quote unquote, thinking about what to do next. It's going to try and design or evolve or optimize an action here that's likely to extract the most information from its environment, from its own physical body.
This be an exploration versus exploitation?
This is very much an exploration versus exploitation discussion. This whole thing is exploration. Learn about yourself. This over here, which we've talked about before in this course, this is exploitation. Exploit what you know, assuming you have an accurate understanding of your environment and self, to get something done, to move, grasp an object. So at the moment, for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to focus on just exploration. The physical robot is going to try and do stuff to maximize its ability to learn about itself.
They try to isolate single motors movements and what that does.
Possibly, right? So if the robot operates like a scientist, one of the things you learn early on is just try and change one thing at a time. But that's tricky because this robot, when it rotates one motor down, it affects both vestibular sensors. You'll just have to take my word for it. It's actually very difficult to isolate. I move like this, and I feel the sensory repercussion there. Now I do this, and I feel the sensory repercussion over there. This robot we deliberately built, so that's not possible. It's a good idea, but off the table. Other ideas?
You could try to involve an action that for all the different models you have that currently have the same value, have the most distinct value.
Bingo. So remember that at this point in time, the real robot's understanding says, I have all these different self-models. Why don't I use them? That's why there's this arrow here. Why don't I use them to design this next action? So this action that it just performed, the real robot just performed, was to rotate, I forget what it is. Let's call this motor 6 and motor 8 downwards. If we take that action, rotate motor 6 and motor 8 downwards and rotate all the motors upwards, and we sent that action into these simulators, what are these simulators, what are these self-models saying? Are they agreeing or disagreeing? We take that action and we feed it into all these self-models, which we've already just done. They produce virtual sensor data. The virtual vestibular sensors here, they all rotate 10 degrees forward. All the self-models here are in agreement about what would happen if the real robot rotates motors 6 and 8 down and rotates all the others up, right? They're in maximal agreement. Coming back to your intuition about do the opposite thing, the opposite thing, we're going to define the opposite thing is find an action, find a way of pulling or pushing on these 8 levers that when you take that action and feed it into all the self-models here, they disagree. Let's say we have some action that rotates motors 1, 4, and 7 down and rotates all the others upward. We take that action, we feed it into this self-model, and this self-model says, I predict that we're going to rotate 30 degrees to the left. The self-model actually rotates 30 degrees to the left. We take the same action, 1, 4, and 7 down, all the others up. We feed it into the second self-model, this one. And this one says, you're crazy. I think we're going to tilt 60 degrees to the right. One of them says 30 degrees to the left. The other one says 60 degrees to the right. Take that same action, 1, 4, and 7 down, feed it in to the third self-model, and it says, you're both crazy. The robot's going to rotate 70 degrees forward. Everybody see that? So the self-models are all disagreeing in their predictions about the sensory repercussions of a candidate action. It's a bit of a mouthful. Yeah? Okay. I'm calling these simulators, I'm calling them self-models. I'm now also going to refer to them as forward models. What is a forward model? A forward model is any model that says, if this thing happens, I think this will be the repercussion in the future, forward in time. This is what prediction is all about. It turns out you have forward models throughout your nervous system, but mostly in your cerebellum, just at the top of the back of your neck here. Whenever your motor strip, this part of your brain, starts thinking about things you want to do, like for example, I think about this action, the back part of my brain takes that action as input. It's a forward model, and it makes a prediction about my sensory repercussion. My brain makes a prediction and says, if you do that, you're going to see this blob shaped like this appear in your visual field. Remember BabyBot from the beginning of the course? That's a forward model. So the things that are evolving here are useful for lots of things. One of the things they're useful for is designing an informative action. Everybody get the intuition here? Questions, comments before we push on?
Why not constrain the simulation to be a little bit more like reality? Like say you have to attach a limb to each of the
Okay, why not make the simulator more closer to reality?
Yeah.
We could. You're spending the first 10 weeks of this course doing it, right? I don't know what your hourly rate is. I don't want to pay you to do it. Let the machine figure it out. There's another reason why we want the machine, the algorithm, to design a simulator for us rather than us making it ourselves. I mentioned last time that this whole project was funded by NASA because they're worried about something going wrong with a rover on a distant planetary body. If something goes wrong with a machine, itself changes, and there's nobody there that can actually see what's happened, we want the algorithm to be able to update the simulator or update the self model to reflect what's gone wrong. We'll get to that in a few minutes. That's why we're not doing it ourselves. Okay, so we have an evolutionary algorithm over here. This evolutionary algorithm is evolving a population of vectors like we've seen before. All of these vectors are of length 8, and they're binary. Each element in this population is an action. Each element in this population is a candidate action. It hasn't been performed by the real robot yet. So we take one vector in this population in which there's a 1 in 1, 4, 7. It's saying rotate motors 1, 4, 7 down, rotate the rest up. We plug it into each of these self-models. And we get back the amount of agreement and amount of disagreement in the predicted sensory repercussion for that action. What is the fitness function, do you think, in this second evolutionary algorithm? What are we going to start to evolve these actions to be before we ever send them to the real robot? Are we trying to minimize prediction agreement or minimize prediction agreement?
Minimize agreement?
We want to minimize agreement, or let's avoid the double negatives here. We're going to evolve these actions to maximize prediction disagreement. We're looking for an action among all 2 to the 8 actions. It's actually not that many actions. Among all those actions that gets these guys to argue amongst themselves. They disagree in what they think will happen. If you think about it, if your self-models are disagreeing about what's going to happen, and you actually execute that action, that's good news, right? You've learned something. The worst thing that this thing could do would be to send the same action that it did before, because the models all agree about that action, and it's likely that they're going to get the repercussion that they all are agreeing on, and the real robot has learned nothing. Everybody see that? Question?
How are there 2 to the 8 actions? It seems like motors would be continuous if you choose any.
The motors are continuous, but we tried to keep things simple in this experiment. So it's just rotate the motor all the way up or rotate the motor all the way down. You're right. There's a lot of moving pieces, literally and metaphorically, in this experiment. We try to keep things simple. Good question. Okay. All right. So here's the next action, which doesn't look like much to us, except that it's a different action. You can see now it's rotated these 2 motors down and the rest up, and the robot has tilted 30 degrees to the right. This is not the second action. This is actually the 8th time through this loop. I'm not going to show you all of these alternations or we'd be here all day. Devise an informative action, execute it in reality, get that vestibular result back, and add it to your data set. So this is the 8th action that this real robot has performed. So when it re-enters this evolutionary algorithm, where it's continuing to evolve understandings of self, it has 8 data points. Each one of those data points is a binary vector of length 8. It's the action that was performed, and 2 floating point numbers. How much the real robot tilted left, right, and how much it tilted forward and back. in this 8th loop around, what are the simulators evolving to do in this case now? They're still evolving to be accurate, but how? How is fitness calculated here? Maybe I jumped ahead too far. Let's go back to 2. So we sent a random action. We evolved the simulators as you just saw. We evolved an informative action. We sent it here, and now we come back to this evolutionary algorithm with 2 actions and 2 sensory repercussions. What are we going to evolve the simulators? How are we going to compute fitness now? What does every simulator or every self-model in this population have to do to survive? Match both vestibular sensors, and remember we've got 2 actions. For each action there are 2 vestibular values. So we've got 2 actions and a total of 4 vestibular results.
You have to match them all.
You have to match them all. So for every self-model or every simulator in this population, we send the first action and measure the sensory repercussions in simulation. Then for the same self-model, we feed in the second action and we get the second sensory result in simulation. We have 2 vestibular predictions from simulation, and we have the 2 sets of real vestibular results. We try and minimize the distance between both. Everybody see that? I could start writing out variables, but I think we don't need them. So in order to survive in the second time around, self-models have to be able to accurately reproduce both actions, or more specifically, reproduce the sensory repercussions of both actions. Remember that these simulations were disagreeing about that second action. One thought the robot was going to tilt 30 degrees to the left. The other self-model thought the robot was going to tilt 50 degrees to the right. They disagreed, and by definition, whatever sensory repercussion comes back from that second action, they can't all be right. Some of them have to be wrong. The ones that are wrong, their fitness plummets. They were correct, they matched the first action in that sensory repercussion, but they were wrong about the second one. Down they go, and they get bred out of the population, and they get replaced by offspring of the parents that were more right, and very quickly you end up with self-models that can receive both actions, or either of the 2 actions, and accurately reproduce that sensory result. Does that make sense? Okay. You can imagine as you start to go around and around this loop, it gets harder and harder for these self-models because they've got to explain more and more stuff. If I rotate these motors like this, I have to tilt like this. If I get this action and I have to tilt my motors like that, I have to tilt in this way. So you can imagine that these crazy, very diverse self-models that you see here are going to start to converge on reality. Okay. So the reason why I skipped ahead to cycle number 8 is I'm about to show you this process after we've gone around this cycle 8 times. At this moment in time, you can see the robot still is not sure about self, but halfway through, it figures it out. At this point, every single self-model that you see here is receiving 8 actions, one after the other, and has to explain all 8. And if you don't, you're wiped out of the population and replaced with those that do a better job of explaining all 8 actions and their respective sensory repercussions. You'll see about halfway through this video that it gets 3 out of the 4 legs right. There it is. That self-model explained about 7 out of 8 of the actions and was still getting the 8th one wrong. It produced a child, which produced a grandchild, which produced a great-grandchild, which you can see in the last few seconds of the video, which manages to explain all 8. This robot has no camera on board. It can't see itself. So through this process, it has indirectly converged on a correct description of self. Question?
Are you telling it when to switch from the exploration to the exploitation?
Yes, we're going to tell it in a moment to go over here. We haven't got there yet. It's still just going round and around and around. Now, we're going to tell the robot when to stop doing this, but when we finish this project, I kind of did this and said, wait a second, the real robot should actually know when to switch from exploration, from learning about self, to this. When does the robot know to stop? When is it not worthwhile to continue self-exploration?
The change between the fitness is just too small.
The fitness of which? Remember, we've got two evolutionary algorithms going.
Evolve Sims.
Evolve Sims, right? Because fitness, it explains all 8.
Like you did a 9 and then a 10,
Yep.
11. If the difference between all of those was the fitness was small, then it would be like, well, we've kind of found it.
Possibly. Okay, good observation. So if we keep doing more actions and the fitness here doesn't go down anymore, maybe you've learned enough about self, or the actions aren't good enough yet. But you don't know. There may be new stuff to learn, but you just haven't found that action yet. You were very close with the idea about fitness. Hint, hint.
If you have a model that's accurately predicting each of the new actions, is it just
Could be. Yeah, there's another idea, right? So you get a new action, and there's a model in here that says, well, I explained all 8, and I immediately explained this new 9th one. Give me a 10th one, and I can explain that one too. So you could watch the most fit self-model in here as you go around this loop a couple more times. And if it continues to explain everything, that's probably the winner. You're probably right. That's not bad, actually. There's another way.
could you have your simulated model that produce a new action, and if the real model it matches the simulated model?
Possibly. Let me just continue here. So we really kind of beat the hell out of this robot. We went 16 rounds. Here's the 16th action. This is at the beginning of the 16th round. This is the 16th informative action that the real robot dreamed up. It got that action, and it's now sending that action and that vestibular result to this evolutionary algorithm. This evolutionary algorithm, every self-model has to try and explain all 16. These are what the self-models look like at this point. We're done with exploration, right? So all of the models, you just saw a whole bunch of different models, but they've all converged on exactly the same description of self, and they always agree. This evolutionary algorithm runs out of steam. What does that mean? It means that the fitness landscape for this evolutionary algorithm is now flat. No matter what action appears in this population, all of these simulations, they all agree. You pick another action, they all agree. You pick another action, they all agree. They all have equal fitness, and they have equally bad fitness. All of these models are agreeing. Remember, we're trying to look for an action that causes these models to disagree. So this evolutionary algorithm basically throws in the towel. It says, I can't find any more actions that cause these models to disagree. And these models all look the same. That's it. That's, in this context, that's when the robot, in theory, could know it's done with exploration. In our case, we just hard-coded this value of 16. Okay, we're about to move on to exploitation. Any questions before we do?
Is there a relationship between the number of actions and the number of evolutions that you would do? Like, you said there's like 2 to the 8 actions. Like, I imagine that, you know, if you had 2 to the 64 actions, that slope would go much higher, and maybe you could kind of calculate that it would be around 16, or it's around 64.
It could be. So if we made the action space bigger, we made the values continuous, the motor values continuous rather than binary. There's more actions. So it's actually interesting, right? It might be that this becomes more difficult because now there might be more subtle ways to get the models to disagree.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if there's like a limit that where like you approach 0 where you can calculate that out ahead of time.
You can't calculate it ahead of time. If we could, we wouldn't be doing it, right? That's the whole point. Hard to know. If we built another real robot with a more complicated physical structure, who knows? Hard to say. Other questions before we move on?
Does it ever happen that the simulation like doesn't look like reality at all, but very accurately represents the real robot?
I was hoping someone would ask that. Okay, look carefully. They've all converged, but they're not correct. What's up?
They're not connected to the body.
They're not connected to the body. Yep. What else? Yep.
The ends are like slightly off.
The legs are bent. So I worked on this project for 3 years as a postdoc, which I was hoping would get me a faculty position. It was an extremely stressful situation. We did this experiment many times, and it didn't converge on a correct description of self. I was freaking out until I realized it's actually not a bug. It's a feature. Why? When I ran this experiment from scratch again, went back to the beginning, did it again, the legs were bent in the same way. Hint, hint. Took me a while to figure this out. Let's see.
Could it be correcting for the sim to real noise?
It's correcting for the different, there's still a gap. The gap has become narrower, but there's still a gap.
I don't know how the model works, but from the model it's like a little stick, but in reality it's like a big fin. You need some sort of like area to be more stable.
We're getting much closer, right? Look at the picture of the real robot and then look at its best attempt to describe itself with the pieces we gave it. Remember when we talked about legged locomotion, we talked about mass distribution and polygons of support and all that kind of thing. The real robot does not have a perfectly symmetric mass distribution. There's a heavy battery somewhere inside this main body, which is causing it, no matter what the action is, to tilt always a little bit more to the right than you would expect if this green block had a perfectly uniform mass distribution. The real robot doesn't know that, and it doesn't have the parts to be able to approximate an asymmetric mass distribution in the main part of its body, and also in its legs. And probably the friction is slightly different with some of these legs. The table on which we ran this, the friction isn't perfectly uniform on the top of the table. For whatever reason, these slight bends in the legs is this evolutionary algorithm's best attempt to explain or approximate these things that it cannot explain. Your cerebellum contains tons of forward models about your body and does a good enough job in predicting sensory repercussions of your actions that you're all still alive here to be in class today. They're not perfectly accurate. They don't have to be. They just have to be good enough. Yeah. So the reality gap is super scary, but the optimistic aspect of the reality gap is you don't have to close the gap completely. You just need to make it small enough for whatever it is you want to do, which at this moment in the experiment for the real robot is just explain how much you tilt left, right, forward, and back when you do these 2 to the 8 actions. Anything else before we move on to exploitation? Okay. This part will look much more familiar to you. After these 8 cycles, we take this simulation, this self-model, which we didn't program ourselves. The real robot kind of figured it out. And we start evolving neural network controllers. We start evolving populations of neural network controllers that are evaluated on this simulated robot. And this is the most fit controller we got at the end. What a surprise. The fitness function is move as far to the right as possible during a fixed time period. Send it to the robot, cross fingers and toes, and we managed to cross the gap in this case. I mentioned we spent 3 years working on this project. We shot this video about 3 in the morning in a basement lab. There was myself and my advisor and the PhD student that worked on this project. And there was another undergrad that was sitting at another desk who had nothing to do with our lab, was working on another project. And the 3 of us went absolutely bananas when this finally worked. We had at least partially automated crossing of the simulation to reality gap. And this undergraduate turned around and said, "Dude, that's the evil starfish." So for the last 20 years, this has been known as the evil starfish. We managed to get this published in Science magazine. We got some media attention, and it became known in the public discourse as the evil starfish. So there you go. The evil starfish also made my professional career, so thank you for that. Okay. That's the end of part 1 of this experiment. I mentioned that this project was funded by NASA, that's interested in all these AI approaches and evolutionary algorithms as a method of last resort. So, for NASA's benefit, we continued this experiment. I sent in the PhD student with a screwdriver, and Victor physically removed the motor and the lower leg from the robot. So here you can see the robot performing an action again. So one other detail I haven't mentioned, which is kind of less important for us, which is as the robot is doing exploitation, it's doing whatever NASA wants the rover to do, every once in a while the real robot will go back and play one of its 16 actions. Just periodically. It's kind of like a maintenance check. Go back and do things I've done before, and let's check that they the models still explain what's going on. At this moment in the maintenance check, the physical robot said, wait a second. Oops, sorry. The real robot said, wait a second, the last time I did this action, I tilted 40 degrees to the left, but now I'm tilting 20 degrees to the left. So there's an action that I've now performed, the same action I performed twice. Once in the past, I got one sensory repercussion, and when I do it now, I get a different sensory repercussion. If you were the robot, if you were back inside this darkened box and you did something you've done, you do an action that you've done before, you pull the levers in a way you've pulled before, and now you tilt differently, what conclusion are you going to come to? What's possible here? Thoughts? What can you conclude from this?
Something's different.
Something's different. Good answer, right? Something. Either the world has changed or I've changed. Right? Self, non-self discrimination. It's actually a problem that travels with us throughout our lives, right? Is it me? Okay. In this experiment, in the spirit of keeping things simple, we told the robot, we said, it's you. So we could have obviously, instead of changing the robot's body, we could have put the robot on a slope, and it could have got exactly the same sensory repercussion. In future work, we tackled this problem of self, non-self discrimination in this framework, but we're not going to talk about that today. We told the robot, it's you. Something about you has changed. We're not going to tell you what about you has changed, just that when you do this action, you now get this sensory repercussion. What do you think the real robot decides to do at this point? The evil starfish is pretty smart.
Start testing other actions it's done before.
It could start testing other actions it did before, but it's now, before it even does that, it's got this new action, this 17th action and sensory repercussion. Let me again put this in context. So from NASA, this is for NASA now, this part. Method of last resort. They've got a billion-dollar taxpayer rover on another planet. NASA doesn't know what's gone wrong or what's changed, but something has changed. The robot doesn't know what's gone wrong. The robot does know something's changed. What should the robot do at this situation?
Just start reporting it and explaining it.
report it back to NASA. The robot says, something's changed. I don't know what's changed. What should I do? And NASA says, we don't know what's changed about you either. What can be done at this point?
Start rerunning the exploration cycle.
Start rerunning this, right? The robot could say, well, let's do some more actions. Maybe the robot is damaged. Maybe it's sitting on the top of a huge crater. Something that can't be explained is happening. The worst thing the real robot could do, from NASA's perspective, is start motor babbling. Wow, something seems wrong. Let me just see if I can figure it out. Stop. Hold still. See if you can figure it out. Figure it out by going back in here. Just continue this evolutionary algorithm, but swap out the original action and replace it with that new action, with that new result. So this evolutionary algorithm continues trying to match self-models against this new set of 16 actions. Here it goes. The robot says, I used to have four legs. Maybe this is the situation. Maybe my leg shrunk. Maybe that my right lower leg shrunk. It's actually getting close to the answer. This robot is smart in many ways and dumb in other ways. It doesn't really understand physics very well. It doesn't know that a shrinking leg is impossible. But it's kind of close. We continued around this process, and in the spirit of time, I'm just going to jump ahead. In the end, the robot converges on this. It says, yeah, this is what my body is like now. I still have four legs, but the lower part of my right leg has shrunk to a toothpick. It's wrong, but good enough. Okay. We/NASA say, well, you've changed, but your mission hasn't changed. Your mission is still to move to the right. So we go back to the third evolutionary algorithm here with this self-model, and it starts re-evolving neural controllers inside this robot now. The original controller that got the undamaged robot to move to the right, how well do you think that does inside this robot? Right? Its fitness drops, that controller's fitness drops, because it probably doesn't get the 3.5-legged robot to move to the right, and is rapidly replaced by increasingly fit controllers that get this robot to travel to the right. Yet another example of perverse instantiation in this course. The virtual robot, at least, is doing what we want it to do, which is to move to the right, but probably not in the way we want it to. What's wrong here? What's cringe here?
It did also shrink its back leg, too.
There's lots of things that are wrong here. There are things that are incorrect. Yeah? Okay. Let's take this evolved controller, this most fit controller, and send it back to the robot. It's moving to the right. It's what we wanted. It's okay, but not great because
Still a part of it, also still kind of attached, dragging behind, that could be affecting how it's moving.
maybe this is on Enceladus. As far as we know, there's nobody there to cut the cord. You know, you got to do the best you can. This is full autonomy mode. You'll notice the robot travels in a semicircle. It ends up kind of facing backwards. It's not, we didn't say we didn't want that, but it's not very satisfying as a legged gait here, but not bad. We originally built the evil starfish thinking it would evolve a controller that gets it to stand up and walk with something approximating a four-legged gait. It never does. It does this weird shuffle, throwing its weight forward along the ground. Why? Remember our discussion about locomotion, the four desiderata? Why doesn't it stand up and walk with a very careful quadrupedal gait? Well, this one can't because it's no longer a quadruped, but
It's unstable.
it's unstable. So in simulation, some of these virtual self models would tip over and roll in the opposite direction. Not great. It's almost like peristalsis. It kind of, you can't see it so much in this one, but if you go back and watch the undamaged robot, it's kind of this undulatory, dragging, throwing its weight forward. There was nothing in the fitness function over here that said stand up and walk in an energy efficient manner. Right? Just a reinforcement of the intuitions we built up when we talked about locomotion. Okay. Any questions about that project before we move on to the third and final attempt to cross the gap? Yes?
How do you decide like what break or mutation to model? Like that shrink decision seemed kind of arbitrary.
Yes. So the shrinking was kind of arbitrary. So I threw in a couple of mutation operators like you can shrink and grow body parts, which seems again kind of arbitrary. I kind of felt bad for the evil starfish. Why did I put that in?
To help it compensate for the sim to real transfer and like how the mass of its legs and like friction is going to affect that.
How to compensate for mass, friction, wires dragging, the table's not perfectly level. I could have put all of those things in, but I was interested in just giving it shrink and grow, which at the time I thought might be a simple way for it to be able to approximate these other things. I could have also thrown in the friction coefficients. This thing could have evolved the friction coefficients of the feet. I could have given it a whole bunch of additional parts that it could move around on top of the body of the virtual robot to more accurately approximate mass distribution. But I wanted to see how well it would do with a very simple set of building blocks. Only a few things, some of which are physically impossible for it to approximate what's going on. And it turns out that it was good enough. Yep.
When it gets damaged and it's relearning its body and how to do stuff, is there ways to like prevent it from taking actions that could potentially damage it further and make this harder? Because I feel like you're in space, you're on a distant planet, you're doing these, not random, but these actions, you could potentially do something that'll rip another leg off.
Absolutely, right? So you have a machine that's in a distant environment. So in robotics, we talk about the 4 Ds. We would presumably like to make autonomous and reliable machines that do jobs that are distant. Remember what the other 3 Ds are? Distant, dull, dirty, dangerous, right? So the robot knows it's in at least one of those 4 Ds, possibly all 4. You got to think carefully before you act. There's a great quote that comes from neuroscience, which is about why do we have all these forward models? Why do we and some other species on this planet have this ability to time travel? We can predict into the future. I see something that kind of looks like the edge of a cliff. I wonder if I were to take 3 more steps, I wonder what would happen to me. Part of what your brain does, it's a locomotion machine, but it is also a prediction machine, is your brain allows your hypotheses to die in your stead. One of the benefits of being able to model self is you can think about what might happen to self in the future if self does this and self does that. It has real survival value. One of the things that NASA has been continuing to do since this project is explore that. For most rovers, or most of the things that NASA sends out there, those machines have all the time in the world to think before they act. That's not always true. Sometimes a rover might find itself sliding down the sandy slope and it's noticing that it's accelerating. then maybe you don't have as much time to think. There's a balance between acting and thinking. But most of the time, these very expensive machines, NASA would prefer that they think very carefully about what to do next. The tricky thing is defining formally, what does it mean to think carefully? How do you ensure that your hypotheses die in your stead rather than you dying? Other questions?
Do you see, like, do they, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. Have you seen any experiments where the robot's also given ways of sensing, like, the shape of the environment, like, say, some type of LiDAR, so it can, like, tell how the environment is around it, so it can maybe incorporate that into how that's affecting its model?
Yes. So we've been talking this morning about self models. We failed to cite a very prominent AI researcher, and he got really, really mad. He felt we should have cited him. So he published a paper a few years later called World Models, which is about what you're talking about, which is a machine, a physical machine that can use LiDAR and video to model the world out there. And in good academic tradition, he deliberately did not cite us, and world models became very famous in machine learning. Fine. Of course, we do both, right? And autonomous machines ultimately will do both. You need to be able to model the world around you, or you're going to be in trouble. And you need to be able to model self, or you'll be in trouble. So yes, there are attempts. There's a lot of work in robotics now around self-modeling and world modeling. The researcher that we snubbed is much more famous than I am, so some of you might have heard of world models and might not have heard of self models until today. Okay, enough personal digressions. Let's tackle, in the 20 minutes we have left, we'll start in on lecture 16, which is the transferability project. Same goal, let's try and narrow the sim to real gap. But they're going to build up their approach on a very, very different intuition, which is when they evolve controllers, they're going to evolve controllers that not just get the simulated robot to do whatever it is we want it to do, they're going to also evolve those controllers to be transferable. So everything we've seen so far in this course, there's been one value. Yeah, we've looked at univariate fitness functions. There's kind of one thing we want it to do. We've seen a few exceptions, like in the bipedal locomotion experiment, where there were multiple things that we wanted a controller to do. In the transferability project, you're going to see that there's two numbers they're trying to maximize. The first one is go as far to the right as possible, and the second one is be as transferable as possible. If you can evolve a controller that is both efficacious, meaning it gets the robot to do what we want, and transferable, you've crossed the gap and you get what you want. There's a problem with that beautiful intuition. What is it? How do we evolve controllers to be both efficacious in simulation and transferable? I'm leaving out one huge detail, the elephant in the room. We're evolving controllers on a simulated robot to get that robot to move as far to the right as possible and for the controller to be transferable. You should be confused at this point. How do we know a controller is transferable until we transfer it? It's kind of like this is the chicken and the egg here, right? So we send the controller to reality. Oh, it's not transferable. We send the next one. It's kind of transferable. We send the third one. Not transferable. Why are we doing simulation at all? We're sending every controller to reality. Okay, we're going to start there. So the first question that these researchers asked themselves back in 2010, so this was 4 years after we published the Resilient Machines project, is could the transferability of the controller be added to the fitness function? The problem that immediately comes up is how do you define transferability other than just send something to reality. They're going to start by solving this problem by defining two variables in the fitness function. One rewards for traveling to the right, and the other one rewards for transferability, which is the similarity between the behavior that controller causes on the simulated robot and the behavior that that controller causes in the real robot. Okay, how are they going to do that? They're going to use a particular kind of evolutionary algorithm that you might not have seen before. This is extremely popular. It's known as MOO, multi-objective optimization. We saw before in the biped experiment where they multiplied a bunch of fitness terms together. You can also add them together. You can add them together and put weights in the front if you care about one term more than the other. It's hacky, it's arbitrary, it's not a good way to go. So what if we take these two desiderata, these two things that we want, rightward motion and transferability, and we separate them? If we do, we're going to assign two numbers to every controller. So this is a geometric representation of how MOO works. We have, let's say we have these many controllers. And let's imagine, for the sake of argument, we've transferred every controller from simulation to reality. So we know the transferability of this controller. We know the transferability of this controller. We know the transferability of this controller. Kind of defeats the purpose of using a simulator, but for the purpose of introducing MOO, let's just assume that's the case. If this is an evolutionary algorithm, at this point in time, this is the population of controllers, and this is the transferability and efficaciousness of every controller. Who lives and who dies going into the next evolutionary generation? Who's good, who's bad here?
The bad ones are probably the ones on the edges.
Which edge?
Either edge. Like the one that's really, really transferable, but
This one?
behavior.
Very transferable, right. So this is an extrema, right? This particular controller is really good at one thing and really bad at the other. So what do we do with extrema? Here's the other one. This one is transferred terribly, but it really got the simulated robot moving. Keep, toss.
Maybe keep. I don't know.
Maybe it's got one of the two things down pat, right? So MOO is a little bit of a pack rat. We're going to keep the extrema. They're tricky. Tell me about some of the other controllers where it's obvious they're gone. Who's gone?
The ones that didn't transfer very well and also didn't get very far.
Right. So the ones that are not transferable, the ones that are further to the left, and the ones that were not efficacious, the ones that are lower in this picture. The ones that are lower and to the left, they're gone. 1, 2, 3, 4, you're gone. What about this one here in the middle? Keep it? Okay, we're back to like making arbitrary decisions here, which we want to try and avoid. One of the reasons why MOO is so popular is that we're going to see in a moment that we can get away with we can throw away these arbitrary decisions. In MOO, we're going to visit each controller one after the other and decide for that controller keep or toss according to a very simple heuristic. There's no weighting functions, there's no nothing. You're gone, you stay, or you go. What do you think that heuristic is? Let's visit this one here. We're trying to decide for this controller. How do we decide?
Is it like it got outperformed by someone else? So
It got outperformed by someone else. Can you be a little bit more specific? What does it mean to be outperformed?
there's someone that did better in both.
There's someone who did better in both. So we visit each controller in turn, and we now look at all the other n-1 controllers. And if we find one, here's one, that it outcompetes it, it's better at both. This controller is more transferable and more efficacious than this controller. So this one, deleted. What about this one? There's another controller out there that is better at both. How about this one? How about this one? Is there someone that is better at both relative to this one? There's some that are more transferable, these ones, but worse in terms of behavior. There are these ones over here, these three, that are more efficacious than this one, but less transferable. They're further to the left. So this controller is what's known as non-dominated. There is no other controller that dominates it. This one down here is dominated. There is another one that dominates it. Okay, let's come back to the extrema. Are the extrema dominated or non-dominated? So let's take this extremum here. Is there another controller in the population that is better at both, that dominates it? There isn't. So whoever said keep the extrema, you were right. They're non-dominated. Same thing down here. Okay. We know which ones we're going to delete and which we're going to keep. So in this cartoon example, how many survived into the next generation? 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When I made this slide, I made a mistake. This one down here. I always leave this mistake in so that you can learn from my mistakes. Okay, so the nice thing about Mu is we don't have any weighting function. We don't have to make these arbitrary decisions. It's actually very simple. We've freed up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slots. There were in this cartoon example, there were 5 dominated solutions. They died off. How do you think they're replaced? We have 7 survivors. We've got 5 gaps in the population now. How do we choose parents and produce offspring?
Would you want to choose the extrema and maybe like the most middle of the road option to alter?
Maybe we could weight the extrema, but again, we don't want to get into this arbitrary thing. How do we keep things simple here? 7 survivors, 5 empty gaps in the population. Thoughts?
Just like one of, just group all of them together.
Group all of them together. Doesn't really let each one of them produce an offspring, but then we've got 7 offspring. So we've got 7 survivors. Roll a 7-sided die. Whatever number comes up, 6 comes up. You're the winner. You get to produce 1 child. Now we got 4 empty slots. Roll the 7-sided die again. This one is the winner. It produced an offspring. Keep rolling die and produce single offspring from single parents until we fill all the empty gaps. Let's imagine that at this point we rolled a 6. Individual 6 produced an offspring. This offspring, sorry, just gave it away. What happens at the next generation? What's happened to this parent down here? It's a tough world in Mu. This parent used to enjoy non-dominated status, but it's now been dominated by its offspring. If any of you here are parents, you know how this feels. It happens, right? So what happens to the parent? Out you go. What happens if we continue to run this particular evolutionary algorithm forward? How do you think this visual representation changes?
Maybe like a line that slowly moves.
A line or a front, borrowing some military terminology here. This is known as the Pareto front. In this case, we're trying to maximize transferability and maximize efficaciousness, maximize movement to the right. So we want this front to move up and to the right as far as possible. So if you visualize this evolutionary algorithm, you'd see this front moving up and to the right. Is it always going to be populated by 7 individuals? Not necessarily.
Do we care about the slope of that line? Do we want to try to keep it close to 1?
Maybe. There are thousands of papers that have been written about this algorithm. There are little tweaks you can put and say, I'd like to kind of push further in the middle than I do at the side. I'm showing you the maximally stripped down version just so we have an intuition for how this works. Does mu have to stop with 2? What if we evolved the robot in this experiment? What if we evolved the controllers in this experiment to be transferable, travel as far to the right, and be as energy efficient as possible? Some of you have asked about energy efficiency before. We could add a third objective. What happens to mu in that case?
It gains another dimension that you were looking at.
So we've got a third dimension now. So now you've got to think about a cube. We've got objective 1, objective 2, objective 3. For the sake of simplicity, let's imagine we're still trying to maximize all 3. We want to maximize energy efficiency. What does the Pareto front look like in 2, tri-objective optimization? We just saw BOO, bi-objective optimization. What happens in 2? It's a plane or a surface. In the cartoon example that you've seen here, at any given point in time, there's about half of the individuals are non-dominated and half are dominated in 2 dimensions, when we have 2 objectives. What do you think happens when we go to 3 objectives? What does the distribution of dominated to non-dominated solutions start to look like? A third are where?
Dominated?
Sorry?
Third dominated?
A third dominated, so that there's more non-dominated.
Third non-dominated.
A third are not, so there's less that are non-dominated compared to dominated. That's one idea. Other ideas?
Each addition, do you keep the dominated, or do you just get rid of them completely?
They're killed off, gone. For now, we're just trying to build up an intuition for multi-objective optimization in general. What happens if we start to march up objectives? You remember all the way back at the beginning of the course, I said ultimately our society is interested in autonomous machines, but also safe machines, reliable machines, I don't know what else. There's multiple things that we're going to want our machines to be. So this is actually very important. How do we go about optimizing controllers or machines to be really good at many things?
Well, the more of those objectives we add, the more non-dominated populations you're going to get.
Imagine that I could see all of your grades. And I know you all take this course, so I rank you all based on your grade in this course. There's going to be one of you that's non-dominated, whoever's currently got the highest grade in the course. The rest of you are dominated. Now, imagine I look at all of you and I find the subset of you that have taken 2 of the same courses, 2 objectives, and I want to see now who's dominated and non-dominated. You're going to get a picture that looks more or less like this. Now I take the smaller subset of you that have taken 3 courses in common. There's going to be many few of you in that course that are there's many few of you that are going to be dominated. You had to do worse than someone else in all 3 classes, right? It gets harder and harder as you march up dimensions to be dominated, because that means there has to be someone else or other controller that's better than you at everything or at all of the objectives. Why does that matter? What happens if everybody is non-dominated? We get a population that looks like this. Now what do we do?
It's probably going to make it take longer to train because it's making modifications to more models and having to evaluate those.
Maybe. We're keeping the same number of individuals in the population constant, so it's not that there's more.
Aren't you kind of done? Have you reached your...
You're kind of done, right? So our simple heuristic so far is kill the dominated solutions. There are no dominated solutions here. There's nobody to kill. Therefore, there's no empty slots in the population. This evolutionary process grinds to a halt unless we add some complication to the algorithm. We say, if everybody's non-dominated, I don't know, we randomly pick someone and kill them off, but it's not very satisfying. So there's a real hard problem here. It's often known as the curse of dimensionality. It shows up all over in all sorts of different branches of math. And here it is raising its ugly head in optimization, is if we want to optimize controllers and machines to be good at a lot of things, it actually is hard to optimize them to do so, because this beautiful, elegant algorithm we've just developed very quickly runs out of gas. Okay, this is a little bit of a digression from sim to real, and we're out of time for today, so we'll come back and tackle the transferability project on Tuesday. Until then, have a good rest of your week.